Hello, I am Sophie Hooper, the Head of Policy at IWFM. Welcome to today's episode 87, Revisiting the Building Safety once more. 2023 is a year where the principle from various pieces of building and fire safety legislation will meet the reality of implementation. Preparations for the new regime should be in full swing. Earlier on the 23rd of January, we saw the Fire Safety Regulations 22 coming into force, which in turn will feed into the information requirements of the Building Safety Act 2022. The first draft regulations implementing that act have been laid before Parliament, and none too late, as principal accountable persons can start applying to register their buildings from April onwards. Today, we will hear from the regulator about the key changes and HSE priorities coming down the line, how reforms will impact practitioners and organisations, and how the HSE is supporting organisations. We will also discuss key questions from a practitioner's perspective, the key areas to tackle, and the role of the Building Safety Alliance in supporting organisations and individuals alike. I would like to remind the audience that we will have a Q&A session and we may take some questions early on. So please post your questions to the Q&A box from now on, not the chat function. And if you would like to remain anonymous, then please type Anon before your question. So before we get started in this session, may I please ask Andrew and Anthony to introduce themselves and share a little bit about who they are. Andrew, can you please start?
Yeah, of course. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Moore. I work for the Health and Safety Executive. I've worked for the HSE now for 20 years. The majority of my time at the regulator has been in a regulatory role as an inspector. I started off in agriculture, and then I moved to construction, where I've spent the majority of my time. And that's very much as a field inspector, but then managing field inspectors, taking action on a site basis. More recently, I moved into a policy role, and more recently still on the BSR program, where I take the role as the industry competence lead. And I'll during the presentation I'll describe what what HSE does in terms of the industry competence priorities.
Thank you, Andrew. Anthony?
Good afternoon all. Anthony Taylor, and I've spent the last 30 years or more in health and safety, risk management and so on and so forth. I had experience in both the private and public sector. I've worked in a number of different industries as an insurance, and I was involved with a tour operator for a while. But over the last 5 years, as you see on the thing there, I was the chair of Working Group 8, which was set up by the Competence Steering Group to look at the role of the Building Safety Manager. I worked with Sophie. When we delivered that, it was delivered into the BSI, and I was part and parcel of the steering groups looking at the development of PAS 867, 1, 2 and 3 for the principal designer, principal contractor, and those managing building safety in occupation. As you know, the building safety manager role disappeared, so we rewrote the PAS, and it's come, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Once we dealt with that, there was a great success, I'd have thought, in bringing a number of bodies across the occupied residential sector together. So we've created the Building Safety Alliance. Again, I'm going to talk about that briefly. And I'm the interim chair of that while we settle it all out. So, and I also serve on the IWFM Life Safety Working Group, which Sophie chairs.
Thank you, Anthony. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah. So, hello everyone. Really excited to bring you up to date on what HSE has been doing over the last 3 years now in terms of building up to the launch of the BSR in October 23. If I could have the next slide, please, if that's okay. And so the presentation today, I'm going to talk to you for maybe about 15, well, hopefully no more than 15 minutes. Really just give a bit of an overview about what we're doing in the BSR. Focus mainly from the competence angle. That's where my expertise is. And then drilling down to more specifics into the in-occupation side and thinking about some of those requires, and particularly the regulator's perspective on those requirements. So yeah, if I could have the next slide, please. So this is just a bit of an overview, and as I'm sure many of you will be aware, just giving some context, the in the wake of the Grenfell tragedy, Dame Judith Hackett carried out an independent review of buildings, and she found essentially that the regulatory system for high-rise buildings and complex buildings wasn't fit for purpose. And one of the key recommendations she made was the establishment of the building safety regulator, really to help re-establish confidence in the system, to people to ensure that they are safe and feel safe in their homes, and to ensure a more stringent regulatory regime, which will hopefully again build people's confidence in the building safety system, but also particularly avoid that dreaded race to the bottom and create a more even playing field. So the key functions of the building safety regulator are very, I suppose we used to split them into three. I think you can probably split them into four now. And that's the HRB regime, high risk building regime or high rise building regime. And that has elements that touch on the construction side and also elements that touch on the management side, which obviously well focused today. There's the oversight of building and standards, the regulation of the building control profession, and competence across the built environment, which again will be a bit of a theme going forward today. If I could have the next slide, please. So competence. I think again this is one of the key tenets for the BSR. It doesn't get the publicity of the high-rise buildings regime, but actually it's equally important part of what BSR is looking to do. And the BSR have a responsibility and a requirement to promote competence of those working in all buildings. And I really want, it's important for me to double down on this point, because certainly there's lots of comments come back of people say, well, actually, well, this won't apply to me if I'm not working on high-rise buildings, etc., etc. But actually the competence elements looking to promote will apply across all buildings, and HSE's BSR's emphasis will be for all buildings. So I think it's important to double down on that message a little bit. And the approach to competence we take really follows the recommendations of Dame Judith Hackett, that the industry should come up with frameworks and standards to measure itself against. It's not government's job to do this, although we want to support it from government BSR perspective. We acknowledge those who are doing the jobs best understand what needs to be done, and therefore we work with organisations such as the BSI and CSG, and we'll obviously Anthony mentioned them, and we'll talk about them in a bit more detail, and particularly the PAS standard, which obviously we'll go into a bit more detail later on. I think it's important to give a bit of a shout out to the work of the Competence Steering Group, the CSG, who have been working very hard over the last number of years. Obviously, Anthony was a chair of Working Group 8, but as you can imagine, there's lots of different working groups to try and come up with standards people can work towards to understand what the competence requirements are for their particular profession or sector. And there's also the Competent Persons Forum, which goes into the competence required for people working on competent person schemes, those schemes where building control approval isn't required. So I suppose rather than to go into detail of any of that, it's just to highlight that a lot is going on in this space. And if we could have the next slide, please. Yeah, and as a way for us to kind of coordinate this and think about how we take it forward, within the BSR, we have recruited to or appointed to a interim industry competence committee, which is really, which we still have a pivotal role advising industry, but also advising the BSR, and look to really provide that link between industry and the BSR to help us guide what are the priorities, and what action do we need to take, and what do we need to do to have the best results. So this diagram just sets out in probably a very simplistic overview of what we're actually looking to achieve. So starting off with facilitating persons to improve competence. There's sorts of actions that we can take as a committee and as a regulator, but also research to really learn and understand what the key issues are, what the key drivers are, what the key barriers are, and then monitoring just to see if there are KPIs we can pick up, and just to make sure whether or not improvements are actually occurring. So monitoring, let's just pick up on the monitoring very briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's really fundamental that as the BSR we have an idea about where the strengths and weaknesses are, and I think initially we'll be monitoring on outputs. So we'll be thinking about sort of the development of frameworks. Anthony, the team have done via Working Group 8 and latterly the British Standard, but also the training, the development of training, validation, and actually just making sure that these things, the infrastructure to improve competence, is there and in place so people can access it. I think later on we'll start monitoring outcomes in terms of whether or not that has led to people better behaviours, acting in a competent way, and ultimately to safer building. So again, that's all part and parcel of the work we're looking to develop in this particular area. Can I have the next slide, please? So just before jumping into the kind of the detail around the law and the regulations, etc., I just thought it might be helpful just to stand back a little bit and just give you a reflection upon some of the work that we've been doing in HSC to think about how we can best land our messages and how we can best promote what we're looking to achieve. And through doing this, we carried out some research as to who are the audiences we're trying to speak to, and the researchers categorized the built environment. Obviously there's a myriad of different players within there, but they categorize the built environment into pretty much 4 boxes that you could put pretty much everyone into four different boxes. And the first box is optimistic and welcoming. These are generally larger organizations, good resources, and a flexible ability to support change, and they were very optimistic and welcoming to the new regime. The next box is the open but anxious, so that they are that they're interested in the change, that they are not pushing back against it, but obviously there are resource barriers and limitations. Then there's the aware but constrained, again possibly less supportive, but not totally pushing back, but actually again questioning what their particular remit is. What does it mean for me? I think that would probably be the most common question in that box. And then there's the final box, the unaware and unconcerned, people who either deliberately or otherwise are totally disengaging with it. So, well, it's if it's not really going to happen, or it's not going to affect me, and etc. etc. So and the reason I just set this out is to say that actually from the BSR perspective, we recognize that people are at different points on the journey, and we want to actually try and tailor what we're doing to reflect that. So for the people on the far left, it's really just about providing a little bit of support, a little bit of nudge, high level guidance to help them. For people more on the right, it's actually about really trying to make this real, and maybe providing something a bit more prescriptive and saying that this is going to happen, and this is how it happens, and this is exactly how it affects you. So again, just a bit of an overview of the approach we are hoping to take within the BSR, and the fact we recognise the complexities. If I could have the next slide, please. So yeah, so now we're going to get into a bit more of the detail around the requirements of the Building Safety Act, particularly for the in-occupation side. Part 4 is the key element for the non-construction in occupation, the building management side. As has been mentioned, there are new roles in terms of the principal accountable person, and in most cases these will be a freeholder, head leasee, management company, or a resident management company. And I suppose the most important message is that the principal accountable person will have the legal responsibility for ensuring that they understand that the fire risks, structural risks are managed within their buildings. So it's very much they are the person who has the responsibility. It does not mean that they have to do everything themselves. We recognize that some different organizations will have different structures in place in terms of how they will manage these roles. Sorry, yeah. And I think probably sort of the best thing to do is just kind of go through some of the key responsibilities the AP will have, and I think again possibly just to list them out, but there will be the registration of high risk buildings, which I think is obviously quite important to get that registration in place, building an assessment certificate, and then the building safety risks, getting that safety case material in place, and particularly a safety case report, which are I'll talk a bit about later on, as I understand these are some of the things that have caused the most concern. And the residents' engagement strategy, I think, is really important, particularly post Grenfell, ensuring information flow to residents so they are cited and engaged on those key decisions. I'm not going to go into all of that in lots of detail. I just wanted to kind of give a bit of an overview of those are the kind of the key requirements and the role of the principal accountable person. Go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I think here what I want to, I suppose, address is the competence elements now that's required for that role, and what the competence landscape really looks like, I suppose, for those managing buildings. As I set out before, that the legal responsibilities are attained with the accountable person, and the legal instrument for an occupation will be set out in secondary legislation, the prescribed principles, regulations for high-rise buildings, and this legislation is currently being finalised by DLUC. As you may or may not be aware, as Anthony mentioned previously, with the removal of the excuse me, the BSM role, that took away some of the competency elements around Part 4. So the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, DLUC, are reintroducing those competency elements at a high level within the within secondary legislation. So there are competency requirements within the law, and the law will be quite high level. It won't go into lots of detail. It will generally say all of the actors who work on high-rise buildings will need to have the right competence. And from my perspective as a regulator, that's kind of fine in terms of the level of detail, because actually, if the law says everyone needs to be competent, how do we understand what competence means? Well, we refer to, as Anthony mentioned previously, the PAS standards, and obviously this was developed by a number of people who representing a number of different in-occupation elements to set out what they thought were the key competency requirements for those managing buildings. So as the regulator, we will look at that and say, well, that's our benchmark. That's what we expect people to that's what we expect people to achieve, and we use that as part of that process. But I think I'll talk about some of those enforcement elements a bit later on. Yeah, and as I say, the British standard is there, and I think it's really important that that's there, because actually that sets that benchmark, that sets out that detail as to what needs to be achieved. I understand there's lots of organisations taking lots of different routes in terms of having the right competent people. I understand some have retained the BSM type model as it works for them. I understand others have decided that doesn't work for them. And I think that's essentially why that BSM role was removed to provide that flexibility for organizations to actually not have a one size fits all approach, actually to have opportunity to come up with a strategy and have the people in place which suits their business model. Also reducing cost to residents, and again, also I think there was a misunderstanding about what the BSM role would actually be. But I certainly, from my perspective, from the HSC's perspective, an outcome-based approach is always good, rather than being totally prescriptive, one size fits all mechanism of how this needs to be achieved. But again, I'll talk a bit more about what the kind of the key requirements are in a sec. Can I have the next slide, please? Now I think what I've done here is I've missed a slide. I think I've got time to talk about the golden thread. Maybe I'll come back to it later on. I was going to talk about the golden thread, but I've obviously not put a slide in. Maybe I'll circle back to it if we've got time later on, because I think I'm probably going over time a bit. So let's go on to safety cases. So I just want to talk about safety cases very briefly. Obviously, they are it's a new concept in high-rise buildings, normally used come traditionally from chemicals, nuclear, aviation, as a mitigation for low frequency, high hazard events. I think a building collapse or a building fire fits into that description. And the general concept around safety cases in terms of identifying hazards and making sure risks are in place, I think hopefully should be straightforward to anyone who comes from a kind of a health and safety type background. And I think possibly sometimes terminology is a bit different here, because safety case is essentially that evidence, all of your evidence that you have in terms of reports of fire engineers or anything else that demonstrates that you are controlling the risks. Your safety case report is in a document which summarizes this and sets out how you're managing what you're doing. And I think the test of the safety case report is anyone should be able to pick it up and read it and understand what the risks are. So it should be as accessible to a kind of a non-technical person, and who would be able to understand exactly what the key issues are, how they're being managed in a concise way. And here's proportionality is really key. In my experience, these types of documents kind of either go two ways. Either lip service is made to them, throw a couple of documents in, and they're just really not, they don't do the job they're meant to do, or a totally risk-averse approach is taken. Everything is described, and actually they're impenetrable and they're not working documents. So I think that the challenge is to make something which is a working document, which is fit for purpose. I think what's on the website, I mean, others might disagree, the BSR website is really helpful in terms of the safety case report and the safety case, because it actually takes you through step by step all of the different things you need to consider. It won't give you the answers, but it actually tells you the sorts of things you need to consider for your report. So gives you a very good steer on what needs to go in it. A lot of people have said, can we have a template? And from the BSR perspective, we don't think a template's right, because it's not right for all eventualities. It's not right for everyone. And also a template turns it from a tick box exercise, I think. We're not looking for, it's not about assessing the piece of paper at the end. It's really about that thought process and going through as the person responsible and actually thinking about those issues, making decisions, carrying out assessments. So yeah, we've resisted and pushed back against templates for safety case reports, and we don't think it's appropriate at the moment, and sort of takes it from a active exercise into a paperwork exercise. Now, next slide. I'm conscious, I think I'm going a bit over time here, so I just want to reflect very quickly on the PAS. I was going to talk through all of the different elements, but I don't think I will for timing, and I think maybe Anthony might be picking some of that up. I think what I wanted to do just kind of give some key messages from my perspective, that the PAS can be a little bit intimidating because there's lots of detail in there, but I think actually for lots of organizations, if you go through it, you may find if you're managing if you've got good management systems in place at the moment, a lot of those elements will be covered, or will demonstrate the competency. If you have the competent people managing well, actually you're going a long way to comply with the PAS. And actually you might want to just think about some of the fire and structural safety issues. Not necessarily have that in-house, but have access to that and be able to understand enough to be able to ask those critical questions and understand what comes back. And also some of that, as I described before, the risk assessment and the safety case expertise to be able to pull it all together and produce something meaningful. So I'm going to skip over that slide for time. So can we just go on to the next slide, please? Yeah, I'm just going to talk a little bit about enforcement, just because I think that it might be important to just to draw out some of those key messages. So, I mean, the slide talks about the RM powers, but what I'd like to reflect on is maybe the BSR's enforcement approach or methodology. I think we're certainly not gung-ho about enforcement, and kind of our guiding principles is it needs to be consistent, proportionate and targeted. But within the BSR HSE, we don't see enforcement always as a last resort when other methods have failed. If the risk determines it, we would see enforcement as the first action that we would take if we feel that that's right. Quite often the law is goal setting. It doesn't say specifically. So as I said, specifically what needs to be achieved. So we quite frequently use non-statutory documents such as British standards, such as PASs, to demonstrate a benchmark. And then we would take enforcement action based on that benchmark. One of the questions that I often get is, can we take enforcement action based on non-statutory, non-approved documents? And the answer is categorically yes. If it's a code of practice that has got industry consensus, we can say, well, that's your benchmark. That's where we expect you to be. Please demonstrate how you've met this, or equally effective measures. I think that's really important. I think I've gone over a little bit, so I'm going to stop there. Sophia, have I gone over, or shall I?
You're fine, Andrew. If that's where you want to stop, that's fine. I can give you an extra minute if you'd like.
Well, I wouldn't mind just a quick extra minute. Sorry, Anthony, just to talk about the duty holder perspective around around HSE. I think one of the things that we are looking to achieve is ensuring that the onus, the responsibility is on those who are managing the risks. That's a kind of a key tenet within the sphere of health and safety. But it would be about asking a building manager to demonstrate to us they can prove that fire precautions are working, rather than us looking to demonstrate to them that they're not. And I think that's quite fundamental in the way that this regime will work from the BSR side. We won't be going in predominantly to try and look in every nook and cranny. We'll be saying as a regulator, you demonstrate to us you've looked in every nook and cranny, and show us the evidence that you have. So that was just a kind of a final thought from a regulatory point of view. But I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and happy to take questions. I think later on.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, we have already received a few questions in the Q&A box, and we will definitely address them after Anthony's presentation. Anthony, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Right, let's start. Can I have the next slide, do you think, please, Lauren? Safer buildings for residents and society at large. That is the background of what the Alliance and I and many others have been seeking to do. So what I'm going to do, next slide please, Lauren, is go through a few elements of what we're seeking to achieve collectively, because I think, as Andrew said, there's a big focus on competence, which we'll talk a bit about, and also a big element of cooperation and collaboration. As many of you will appreciate, within the construction sector, there's been a lot of long-term collaboration. They're quite used to it. When we started on Working Group 8, we realized that actually there wasn't so much of that in the occupied residential sector. Lots of people, lots of suppliers, lots of consultants, lots of all sorts of services to a building with residents in it. So we created the Building Safety Alliance to become the forum where we could try and collect as far and as wide across the occupied sector in order to do what we're doing, what we says on the slide there, bringing together representative bodies, driving the culture change. Andrew has touched on that on a number of occasions in various ways, but certainly it came from Jane Judith's original document, her report, that the culture in construction particularly, but also generally in residential housing, has been perhaps not up to scratch. And so we're working across the piece to try and up the culture, to get the right things done, increase the competence, part of which the competence is knowing when your competence finishes, but it also is very keen, and there's quite an element of it on the ethical side, doing the right thing at the right time. So competence has moved from being skills, knowledge and experience, which are all used to being tested against. We've added on, not we, generally the industry has added on the expression behaviours. So skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours are what will make up a competent person at whatever level they happen to be. And the Alliance is trying to guide best practice by way of collaboration. So if we can collaborate and get the main players in the sector to collaborate to come up with the best practice, which we know that the regulator will rely upon, then everybody's on the same playing field. And we feel, and all the feedback I've had across the several years, is that we just all need to understand what everybody's doing, and we're all willing to do it, but we just need to do it collectively. So that's what we're trying to do. Promoting excellence, quite obviously, and delivering cross-industry independent master scheme for validation of competence. I'll come back to that, but it's all very well having a PAS. Many of us will have been used to either our organizations or us as individuals being tested against a particular competence standard, or a particular PAS or particular whatever it happens to be. An ISO would be typical. In the past, a lot of competence and resource checks, if I point at CDM, many of you will be aware of, we're looking at a competent organization or an organization with the competence and resources access to both of those. What hasn't happened perhaps is much judgment of the individuals who are actually doing the work. That's been left to the companies they work for. So we've got a great focus on trying to make sure that the checks on competence and that these organizations are managing the competence of their employees on a much better, a much more formal basis. And supporting the other thing the Alliance is doing generally, and thankfully we work very closely with the regulator and various others and the policymakers to try and get us all to land in the right place. So we support the implementation, and by that what I'm meaning is where we have, as Andrew says, very helpful guidance from the regulator or DULUC. Some of it, and some people prefer much more practical advice. let us say, because I have to be quite a bit careful. But what the Alliance is trying to do is delve into these various laws, statutes, acts, primary and secondary, and come up with practical advice that practitioners can actually use. And that's the purpose of today's discussion, really. Next slide, please, Lauren. This is a slide created by a colleague of mine, Mark Snelling. I'm not going to dwell on it because you'll get the slides, but it tries to map out the sort of web of how all these things interact. We've got all the existing health and safety law, which we know and love and have been using for many, many years. But as Andrew says, the Building Safety Act, the Fire Safety Act, and all the secondary stuff that comes below it overlaps on top of it. So it's become quite a complex web of various bits of legislation. And that tries to map it a bit by way of illustration, and it's quite useful for trying to explain this new regime to clients, I would suggest, and others in senior responsible roles who need to understand where this is all going. So I'm not going to spend any time on that. You've got some dates which are reasonably accurate, but depending on parliamentary time and various other things, some of them may slip a bit. But next slide, please, Lauren. So the bits I'm going to go through now, the immediate requirements. What have we got to be doing now in order to start, getting ourselves ready? Make sure we are ready for it. I reflect on Andrew's 4 blocks of those who are actually on top of all of this and those who are burying their head in the sand. They're going to have a very rude shock in due time. Look at safety management systems. We all know what they're talking about, but they're absolutely critical to the management and to things like safety cases, making sure golden threads are updated, making sure that competence is managed properly, and how this all stitches together, because the regulator is going to be looking at safety management systems to make sure that all the stuff we're talking about stitches together somehow. Competence, obviously, we need to talk about a little bit about the golden thread, a little bit of the safety case report, which Andrew's just spoken about. And I just want to raise some questions about contract arrangements. Next slide, please. So immediate requirements, as you know, as Andrew just said, we are anybody who is the owner of a an HRB 18 meters and above residential with 2 occupied units has got to register that. And now the registration period is opening on, I believe it's the 6th of April, but anyway, April through to October 23, by which time every high-rise, high-risk HRB in the country should have been registered. And if it isn't by then, I think that's going to be a criminal offence. Once it's registered, we've then got to provide some more documentation. And part of the registration process, of course, is who is the principal accountable or the accountable person for this particular building. So the registration is relatively immediate, and we need to collect all that sort of information below. So, sorry, I've got the sun in my eyes here, but there is high-level information, as in what is the address of the HRB, who is the owner of it, who are the people who are going to support the management of it, how many floors, so on and so forth. So the most obvious stuff. Then you've got some more detailed information about the materials. Quite obviously, with all the cladding scandals and everything else that we've had, we need to know about the external walls. Is there anything in there that somebody needs to be alerted about? What's the structure? What's it made of? In very simple terms. Energy, where are the energy stop-offs? What is the energy in there? Is gas stored on it, etc., etc., etc. I won't get into detail because there is detail out and about. And the registration information at the bottom there is really telling you what is likely to be needed. So it's out to consultation. Now, the consultation hasn't yet come back, but I would suggest it's not going to be far off what you got on the list there, including what is the building used for? Is it student accommodation? Is it predominantly elder people, perhaps? So basic information about the building, and that is going to be needed starting April this year. And I know that there are one or two organisations that still haven't decided who the PAP is. Now that can be an organisation, but within that organisation, I think I'm right in saying the regulator is expecting a person, a named person, to be the direct contact. And it takes some time to find it. So particularly those who are in FM and those who are perhaps property managers, you're going to need to know who's the person at the top, because they're the duty holders, not you. You will be supporting the principal accountable person or the accountable person in making sure that their duties are complied with. Next slide, please. Safety management, as I say, they are part of any safety case report, which I'll come on to. And they're there in order to make sure that everybody can know that the whole thing works together, particularly ensuring the golden thread has got the right information at the right time for the right person. Yeah. Now that will include some historic building information. This is particularly for new builds. You know, how was this built? But the information is just sat there. It's not going to be used really in day-to-day management. But the golden thread and the safety case are going to need the current information to maintain the safety and to make sure it's being maintained. And the big thing that I think Andrew's mentioned is the evidence of this. It's not for the regulator to tell you it's not working, it's for us to tell the regulator we're in total control here, we know exactly what's going on, and it's all compliant. And that is effectively our safety case. The focus is on the word case. As I said, it's the PAP's duty, but FMs and others will be expected to assist, and there'll be a number of people who'll be supporting them. The issue with the safety case is that you might have a number of safety management systems. You may have a number of safety management systems, or you will have more likely than one, because the PAP will have to have one, and their safety system might just be that I've asking third parties to help me deal with this. Then the third parties need to have it, and it's all got to come together to make sure that the golden thread's available. Yeah. But the duty remains with the principal accountable person, and they will be required to monitor that the buildings they're responsible for are managed safely. Next slide, please. Competence, as Andrew's mentioned, we've got a number of them there. I'm not going to go through them in any great detail because they're out there. They're free from the BSI website, and I recommend that you read them all and become fairly closely associated with them. IWFM are looking to see how we can translate the training and upskill the training that we may or may not need to look at 8673, and more will come out from that. They all set frameworks. So the idea is you take one of these PASs, whatever your particular duties or interests are, and you apply it to your own business. How do I, as a business or as an individual, because duty holders can either be organizations or individuals. And just as a note there, within the PAS or in the legislation, they tend to use the expression person. And a person in law can mean either an organization or an individual. So just be aware of that when you're reading documents. There will need to be senior individuals within organizations who have the required competence. It doesn't mean to say that you're an expert at everything, but it means to say that you've got to have a pretty good knowledge of everything that people are doing on your behalf. Otherwise, how can you manage them? Yeah. And if an organization is holding itself out as competent, they need to have access to all sorts of bits of competence and information, and they need to understand how that's managed. But in particular, the competence of their own employees, the competence of the contractors they employ. How are they ensuring that their employees are who are assigned to a job are actually competent to undertake that job? And for those who are managing buildings or FMs, the last chance to check is when the individual comes up at reception and says, "I'm this person." Is that the person that the risk assessment or the safe management, safe working procedure actually stated would be there? Is that person competent enough to undertake that? So that's the last chance before he or she gets on the job. Next slide, please. This is very quick. I'm not going to go through that, just to show you how many of these competence frameworks are being developed for different elements of the business, both in construction and in occupation. I'm not going to go on to that. You can have a look and you can see it goes on well into the future, and they will continue to be developed. Next one, please. The golden thread, as I said, the right information, the right person at the right time. Information is going to have to be digital. And I think one of the biggest things that we've got to address, particularly as FMs or people on the ground, is how do we verify the information? Particularly when you take on a new building at onboarding, once you take that golden thread into your control, or on behalf of your client probably, you need to make sure that you've got what you expect. Otherwise, it's your responsibility. And it is a legal duty of your principal accountable person to make sure it's up to date, and they'll be relying on you to do so. Yeah, it'll have to be digital. So that will mean, and certainly in the future, that a lot of this information is going to be moving between systems. And therefore, the management of this data is going to be terribly important. We in the Alliance are working on something called the List, which we've developed originally from an onboarding typical list, but we've got a number of line items that you need to manage when you are managing a building safely. And we're looking at how to place the assurance against that and the records and all the rest of it. That will come out in one form or another in due time when we are looking at providing some guidance. One of the issues that we're also looking at is a minimal viable solution for the golden thread, because we know, and you all know, that there are a number of organizations who are not very sophisticated, still got a lot of hard copy, but it's got to be digitalized. And what we're trying to do is create a minimal viable solution that'll get you over the hump. But we're also looking 10, 15 years ahead to where in the nirvana where everybody's swapping information very easily. And one of the ways we think that'll happen is through a data coding system. So we're looking at some of the codings that are generally used. Next slide, please. Building risk assessment and building safety case report. Now, the building risk assessment is not what we're used to. As Andrew said, you know, this is a new, the safety case process is new to the occupied sector. It's not new to oil rigs, chemical works, or nuclear, but we're trying to bring this in. So there's quite a lot for us to learn here. And a building risk assessment is looking at the whole building with regard to spread of fire and structural safety in particular, or in fact, you know, what could cause a significant accident or incident in your building. So there's lots of guidance out there, and more will be coming. But it's not somebody running around with a clipboard as they have done in the past doing a health and safety check. It is not that. You know, and then at the end of the day, it's got to be recorded. There are various ways of dealing with the assessment. Bow tie is one that has been suggested. There are others. The safety case, which is the output of all of this, is effectively, what is my building made of? You know, is it brick? Is it you know, is it a steel structure? What's it made of? What is it? How are the safety critical systems? How do they operate? Where are they? What's the assurance that these things are operating? Are they the right things in the first place? Yeah. How both of the above are managed. So this is your safety management system. That, you know, I'm really, as Andrew was saying, doubling down on the importance of these. How do we ensure that the competence of all the players that are managing all the stuff above are correct? Yeah, and up to scratch. How is all this monitored? Who's monitoring it? What is the system for checking that tasks are being done correctly at the right time? And
Anthony, I'm very sorry, but you've got 1 minute left.
Okay. I think this is the important bit. The end of it is you're saying in this document, the safety case report, here you are, Mr. Regulator, all these things are answered. It's my case to you that the building is safe to occupy. They're going to call it in about every 5 years, probably starting, I believe, in April 24. Next slide, please. I'm just raising here the contract arrangements. Many of certainly managing agents and property managers and maybe FM organizations will be working to contracts that have been in place to do what we've been dealing with. These, the Part 4 duties and the duties of helping the principal accountable person are slightly different. So you may want to revisit your contract. It's very important you know exactly who's doing what for whom, because if we don't identify who's doing everything, somebody's going to fall through the floorboards. Next slide, please. The new regime, quite simply, it's not business as usual. As Andrew says, the people who are burying their head in the sand are going to get a rude shock. It is not business as usual. It will require strategic direction. So the points I'm putting there, and we'll finish up very, very shortly, are those. And those are the things you need to be looking at now if you're not already. But many of them are strategic rather than tactical. And don't forget that last one at the bottom. All of the above is going to need to be evidence. No one's going to take your say-so that the fire alarm works. You've got to go and make sure it's the right fire alarm at the right time, it's checked, it's monitored, etc. Next one, if there is one. Yeah, the building safety alliance. These are the three main work streams that we're dealing. Trying to look at the golden thread, mapping roles that contribute to managing health and safety, and developing the competence scheme. I think that's the end. I apologise for running over, so I'll finish there.
And likewise, I'm very sorry we had to cut both of you short in a way, because we could talk about this for a long, long time. We've had plenty of questions come in, and we will not be able to answer all of them. But what we will do is take them away, and in the next few weeks, publish an update of all of the questions with an answer on our website. Now, Andrew, starting off the conversation, and it links back to a few people who've asked questions in the chat, well, in the Q&A box, is you were very clear that competence will be benchmarked or enforced against the PAS. That was clear. But what was asked as well is that competence in itself can be quite subjective. And obviously the PAS has tried to set out objective criteria to be measured. But how will the HSE check compliance against the PAS? Sorry,
apologies. Yeah, so from a I suppose a regulatory methodology point of view, we're not going to go in to organizations and say we want to understand the competence of everyone there now. The way that we'll approach it is very much as a regulator, looking at the outcome, looking at the key things Anthony mentioned, particularly around the safety management system, the safety case report, the safety case, etc. And if there are any particular areas or elements where we think there are issues, we will then bring in the competence aspects at that point generally. So we'll kind of track back to particular issues, maybe fire safety, maybe structural safety, maybe a lack of management awareness. And then at that point, we'll bring in particular elements of the PAS goals to say that this is the goal requirement, and you demonstrate to me how you've met it. So what I think one of the benefits of the PAS having it as a goal setting, we're not going to say prescriptively you need to have gone X training course or you need to have da-da-da. But what we will say is how have you explained to me how you've met this in terms of this specific area. Now, if there's issues around that specific area, we will then widen out our remit and our search to other areas of the organization. So again, we will look to assess competence in a very pragmatic way, understanding there are multiple routes sometimes to demonstrate competence. It's not always a one size fits all. There are different pathways. I think as we progress, and there's the work that working group 8 are doing at the moment, building safety alliance, which I think I'm very supportive of, because I think actually bringing that coordination and leadership to the industry I think is really helpful. But as some of that work develops, there will be more prescription there, and as that develops, obviously as a regulator we will use that. But I think at the moment it's very much the goal setting. you tell me, you convinced me that you've thought about the competency requirements, and actually there's a pathway that you've taken to meet those.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sophie, can I just add a quick bit in there about schemes and things?
Yes.
Yeah, the Alliance is, as I mentioned, we are looking at taking the PAS and trying to create a process. We know we've been asked, are you certificated against PAS? Now, there is no such scheme at the moment. So we are hoping to develop one. It's quite a big project and we're looking at it. So it's not going to be immediate, but hopefully in the next 3 months, we will have a process where people can be tested against the PAS and have a certification against it. It's not guaranteed yet because it's a big bit of work, but keep an eye on it, and this IWFM are very much engaged with this, so just keep an eye on the website. We'll keep you updated.
Yes, and we're getting questions from the HSE how we're contributing towards that, so very much part of our regular agendas updates, and we're working towards that. There were quite a few questions around hospitals, and I think they're very important questions, because very often we've had some feedback from members that they think that the new regime is only applicable to residential buildings. But just to read out Stephen's questions, do high-risk buildings include hospitals? Appreciate it isn't residential, however, they do have inpatients who sleep in the building. Andrew?
So the answer is yes and no. Yes, for the construction side. A high-rise building, high-risk building includes hospitals in the construction elements. That's the Part 3 duties of the bill. Currently, it doesn't at the Part 4. So the area that we've been talking about today, the in-occupation, the resident side, hospitals are out of scope at the moment. And I think there has been debate, I think possibly debate in Parliament around this particular issue of what should be in scope and out of scope, and there was I suppose a practical sense that we can't put everything in scope straight away, and that as we move on, that more and more different buildings, care homes, another example, may become in scope to the occupation side as we kind of work our way through. But currently, no is the answer for in occupation, but yes for construction.
Thank you. I've got a question for both of you, and I'll let Anthony try and have a stab first from Nick. Who will pick up the AP role in PFI arrangements?
Ooh, I would say that every AP role is going to depend precisely on the structure of the organisations that are operating the building that's there. Is this PFI regarding hospitals? Because if it's regarding hospitals, then, as Andrew just said, they're out of scope of Part 4. But if it's any other organisation, care homes are out of it as well. But if it's student blocks or any other residential, the things that are out, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, military installations, prisons, detention centres, that sort of thing, care homes and hospitals, everything else and hotels at the moment. So but everything else which is residential, particularly, it's really looking at the risk of people being asleep. So I think it's the way I've looked at it, where there are people on duty, as in a prison or a military barracks or a hospital or a care home, then that is going to be probably brought into scope in future, but not now. Have I got that right, Andrew?
Yes. Sorry, I was trying to find my unmute button. Yes, you have.
Excellent. We've got a question from one member of the audience about what will the registration process look like come April? Will it be an online portal? Andrew, perhaps you best.
Yeah, my understanding is it will be. I'm not intimately involved in the detail, but it's part of our IT delivery program. So that kind of intimates to me that it will be an online system that you will go in and essentially register and provide details about your building. And then once we have those details, HSC will contact you. And at some, we will triage buildings. Again, going beyond the question, but we'll triage buildings based on risk and look to engage with those ones that we deem to be higher risk first, and obviously the lower risk ones later on.
I had heard, Sophie, that the sort of beta version of the registration is being tested by various people. So I believe that is what it is going to be, and they're just trying to test how user-friendly it is.
Okay, excellent. And of course, for the key building information, that will definitely be a formatted portal, because that is not necessarily about the building's safety arrangement in itself, but that's just to look at the wider trends. But that will most definitely be the portal. We are running out of time, and it's officially 1 p.m. So I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, and we will follow up with the questions. I would really like to thank both Andrew and Anthony. Andrew as well hasn't been very well, so I'm very grateful that he was fit to join us today. The key messages really from today are that change really is here, and well, both panelists couldn't be clear enough, but especially Andrew was very clear from an HSC perspective that competence against PAS 8673 will be checked and benchmarked. Now, as IWFM, we will continue to support our members via a variety of tools. One of the tools that we have recently published is the Fire Safety Management GPG. But aside from that, we will continue to work with the Building Safety Alliance and within the Life Safety Working Group, but also we are working on a upskilling and training program to support our members further. And that leads me to thank not just Andrew and Anthony, but all of you. The CPD number is now on screen. Thank you for your questions. As I said, we will get back to them. The recording will also be available on the website from tomorrow onwards, and we will welcome you back in 2 weeks' time for another episode. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.